Romeo that. Okay, thanks Jane. This is actually one of your projects as well, so I'm really excited to present part of your project as well, Jane. Thanks everyone for hanging around. The room's dwindling very quickly, it seems. I'm not sure whether people aren't interested in wetlands, and we should be, or they're busy doing other things. This project is a very interesting one, I guess, and 2016, it was, I think, Jane and Sean and myself talking about this idea of transitioning low-lying cane into some other land use that achieves a water quality objective. And I remember at the time talking to John Brodie about this project and what his thoughts are. And he said to me, great idea, excellent project, we need some data in this space. He also said to me it was a career-limiting project, which is interesting given now 5 years on. We had Scott Morrison this week talking about restoring coastal ecosystems and injecting quite a lot of money. So I don't know whether this project's actually led to that announcement in the last couple of days, but I'd like to think that in some ways we're setting ourselves up for some really exciting times ahead. Lots of stakeholders were involved in this project, way too many to have on stage. I'd have to have a QR code, people walking on and off. So big thanks to the Australian government, state government, RRC for the support we've had over the last few years for this particular project. So we've talked a lot about water quality and the impacts on the reef, and there's a really important transitional area along the coast. These are our coastal wetlands. They are absolutely critical for a whole range of species. They have important cultural values. They do provide water quality outcomes. Really important biological areas that are really worth protecting. And it's along that area where we've modified the coastline, the biggest, the greatest. And so there's this really competing challenge that we face now around industry and protecting and conserving some of these sensitive, culturally significant aquatic ecosystems. We've heard this morning a lot of great science that's coming out, looking at ways of improving water quality, removing DIN, improving nutrients, leading to the reef. And there's some fantastic work being done, and it's pretty exciting times. But I guess another tool to the toolkit is this idea of retiring low-lying lands that's under cane, or previously was under cane, as a way of helping us advance towards our water quality objectives. And so that's where this really sits. It's about these low-lying areas that are right up hard along the coastline, along the mangroves, the salt marsh, those sorts of areas. And the idea is, can we actually transition that land that's very low producing cane, lots of DIN coming off from these areas, and can we actually substitute that with some other land use was part of the exercise. And then secondly, can we actually look at funding mechanisms to incentivise this, to make us profitable for farmers? So that was the hypothesis that we set out. So what am I talking about? This is certainly an area that is low-lying. This is, in fact, I won't say where this is, in case someone in the room knows where it is. This is low-lying caneland. This was previously used and under cane production, but is no longer usable for cane. So these are the kinds of sites that we're talking about, these areas that are low-lying. Can we actually transition these across to some sort of land use that achieves water quality? There are other examples, if you look through Google Earth, where there's still farming that continues, but the land wants to be wet. It wants to go back to potentially some sort of wetland habitat. So you see some really interesting time series photographs. So these are the kinds of areas that we're talking about, those low-lying areas. Can we identify those, and can we transition those across to some other land use? So we did that for the wet tropics. This was a one-year project. It was a scoping exercise. So the results from that work generated a technical report back in 2017, and the manuscript finally was released last week on that work. So that work's been finalised. So we've gone through a process of identifying where those low-lying areas are in the wet tropic catchments. That was the first bit. And then secondly, what we looked at, this is where the economics with Jim Smart came in, is if we do transition those across to some other land use, what exactly are they, and can they actually be profitable for farmers? So we looked at grazing as one potential option, and these are, remember, the low-lying areas. Grazing did turn out to be an economical transition option for farmers. We looked at alternative cropping, and there was about 30 different species or 30 different crop styles that we looked at there. Not so much they were economical, because we're talking about those low-lying areas, and you have cyclones and all that, so it takes a long time to get to marketable size. So cropping, we didn't pursue too far down that process. So grazing, cropping, and not surprisingly, turning them back, potentially back into a wetland, is a very sensible idea. And when you look at the monitor's catching up, there we go. When you look at the economics of that, and this is back in 2016, remember, that the cost to build or transition back to a wetland for ecosystem services, so that's fish production, let's say, or carbon, let's say, is around about $10 kilo DIN reduced. This is back in 2016, remember. If we're constructing a wetland for water treatment, and the reason we separated out wetlands is because one potentially is for fish and the other one is for water quality, and we don't really want to have both those values or services in the same project. Come and talk to me over a lemonade later and I'll tell you why. $20 per kilo DIN reduced. So all of a sudden there's some really interesting numbers are coming out and looking very favourable as an alternative option for these low-lying areas in terms of economics. The extension program, there's some data that came out from Queensland Government with something like about $50 per kilo DIN reduced. I'm not saying we should take extension officers out of production, but just to give some context there, that because they're doing a whole range of other work as well, which is really important, of course. But just to give some context there, that these transitioning to wetlands all of a sudden becomes a really good option for these low-lying areas. So that was for the wet tropics. The dry tropics, we managed to secure some additional funding under the extension round 5, and we've now taken the methodology into the dry tropics. The economics is still being finalised, so we're really close to generating this report. But what has been really interesting as part of the dry tropics now, things like building recycle pits become a really good option for some of these low-lying areas. We get to recycle water, and I was really impressed to hear Eric's talk this morning around some of the data coming out around that. And ponded pasture as well is another really interesting option there. I want to briefly talk about Project 410, and this is just almost finished going through peer review. So the previous work was around taking land out of production for a particular wetland, let's say. What we also were looking at here for this project was this idea of, can you actually scoop a bit of dirt out in building a wetland and use that material to raise the adjacent land? So can you actually, by building a wetland, raise the flood level of the adjacent property, let's say on your cane farm? And so this is a really interesting build on the initial mapping work that we've done and the economics there. And rather than actually set up trials, we have this wonderful opportunity to go back into time and look at the SIPS program in the Tully and Murray. Again, I'm happy to talk more about that over a lemonade later, what the SIPS program was. So we spent time there looking at reviewing some of these existing wetlands where farmers had gone out and, as a way of draining more quickly the properties, build these wetlands to get rid of the water, have used that material to raise the adjacent cane above the floodline. And what we don't know is that actually a profitable exercise? That was exactly what this project was about. Now, this project hasn't been quite finalised yet, but I'm sure I'm among friends I'll show you some results. So with the wetlands, what we looked at was a whole range of ecosystem services, and we used the International Classification Scheme to understand those values. So there was in all about 22 different ecosystem services that these wetlands are providing. Anything from water quality to food production to mental health. The farmers were telling us that these wetlands are a wonderful way to defrag after a stressful day. So really interesting to think about some of the human dimensions that wetlands can actually provide. Some of the economics that Jim Smart's works looked at, that this is back in 2003 when the scheme was up and running, the farmers were making more money out of their properties by doing this exercise. The numbers are there, $118 per hectare and $500 per hectare for converting from cattle to cane. So all of a sudden, we're starting to build on this idea of these marginal areas. Maybe we can be building wetlands and not necessarily losing production. We could be potentially raising the land of adjacent areas. So the journey so far, we have maps, we have spatial layers, which are being used now by a whole range of our end users, which is just fantastic to see. We've got Jarragon are using the mapping to identify new project sites in wetland areas. Reef catchments have been using the wetland data as well, the mapping data, which is great. NESP has been talked about a few times today. They've used the mapping as well in the wet tropics. And Greening Australia are using the maps as well to prioritise and build strategic projects into the future. So a career-limiting project 5 years ago, I think, you know, it is being used, so I'm pretty impressed to be able to report that today. Where this gets even a bit more exciting, and I mentioned Scott Morrison's announcement a few days ago, is if you start to think about these projects where you are bundling services. I don't like the word stacking, bundling these services. So let's say you have a reef credit opportunity. You get paid to improve water quality in a project. Maybe you're removing a bund wall and there's additional services provided by fisheries habitat or carbon, let's say. All of a sudden, these projects start to become very, very attractive. These are low-lying areas. These are very, very possible for us to move forward. So the pathway to impact, I'll use Damien's terminology, we have now a workflow in building spatial layers to identify these kinds of areas, these low-lying areas. I think that becomes very useful if you're wanting to think about de-risking development pressure. And I'm thinking very much so about Northern Australia and that development agenda that's on the horizon there. So these kinds of frameworks become very useful for that. We've been able to identify some low-risk options for farmers that diversifies their income, maybe protects their income by looking at wetlands. It's another tool in the toolkit as we try and advance towards our Reef 2050 target for water quality. And I think there's a really interesting conversation that's coming at us really fast around how we manage all these financial mechanisms, carbon, biodiversity, water quality. How do we actually manage all those in a sensible, a positive, a conservation, a development perspective? We've got a paper that's in revision at the minute that talks about a common asset trust. And we've reviewed the literature around the world where there's these big schemes, it's about 20 different schemes, that have looked at wetland restoration. And we've learnt from that literature and come up with a framework how we could implement a common asset trust in the Great Barrier Reef. Again, it's about 3 lemonades I'm having tonight. Come and talk to us about that if you're interested in knowing a bit more. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.